So welcome to today's webinar, and we're going to be speaking about guiding grief. And my name is Farah, and I am a clinical social worker from the US, and I specialize in working with grief, trauma, and workplace mental health. So I want us to be mindful that typically when we think about grief, we link it to losing someone to death. And while that is absolutely a type of loss, there are also so many significant secondary losses that we're experiencing in our life right now. There is a loss of a sense of safety, safety in being able to go to the store without being worried about someone coming near you. There's a loss of so many different personal, small businesses that we used to go to. So many things have closed. There's been a loss of a normal summer, being able to travel, being able to see family. There is a loss of economic security. So even I find that so many individuals where they feel safe in their job, there can be a sense of anxiety around, but look at what's happening around us. I feel a bit guilty for having a job. There's a sense of loss of what is happening around us. Right, a sense of freedom, being able to travel in and out of Abu Dhabi and different countries. And this is almost if we're thinking about, there's physical loss and there's grief linked to that, but then we talk about the secondary loss, and these are the kind of seismic ripples that loss can have in our life. And we're going to take a deeper look at what that actually looks like. So when we think about what grief is, it's very different from mourning. Okay, so mourning is cultural or religious. It's linked to certain practices. So for example, mourning is 3 days of prayer Islamically, or 40 days of grief that may be permitted. It's a period of time that begins and it ends. It may be wearing black. Grief is the internal experience of loss, and it has no endpoint. It's the thoughts, emotions, feelings linked to longing for someone that used to be in your life. The most defining feature of grief is that it comes in waves. I always describe it like having your back to the ocean and never knowing when the waves will come, and never knowing the size of what those waves may actually be. So it's very common that if you or someone in your life is grieving, right, that they can say, I feel like I'm losing control. Where one minute I can feel okay, and the next minute I feel quite sad or angry or anxious. I need you to know that that's a very normal thing to be feeling. And typically, sometimes the waves can be unpredictable, but sometimes they can be linked to specific things, like when you're approaching a death anniversary or a birthday or Christmas is approaching. Certain things can be triggers, but it can also be smells, wanting to send that person a message. You know, when we even think of the grief linked to trauma and the loss, so when we think of like for example, the Beirut explosion and the loss of a sense of safety or home, right? That next time this year, we can imagine there can be that residual grief of, I cannot believe it's been a year since this happened. So there can be certain triggers we can anticipate, but it can a wave of grief can be triggered by no specific reason. It's hard to find a sense of order in grief. Okay. So I want you to know this is not something that ends. Grief stays with you as long as you live. And usually when I say that to people, they get upset with me. And they say, well, am I going to feel this way forever? Is it going to feel this overwhelming or upsetting? And I will say that when grief is acute and it's fresh, that usually those few months, it's like a big open wound. And during that time, it never feels quite like that. It softens from those initial days and weeks, but then the pain begins to look quite different. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that. And I really love this quote. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was a sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, or acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. It is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, and a new way of seeing, a new definition of self. And I'll say that as a grief counselor, I wish I could banish this word of acceptance, because the word acceptance supports the idea that grief is a linear healing process, that there may be some day, month, or year that arrives that you've accepted your loss. And I would say, I would really like to change the word of acceptance to adjustment. You will learn how to live with your loss, and people learn how to live with it. But acceptance, it doesn't accurately describe the healing process, right? So you can have moments of acceptance or feeling like, I understand that I'm no longer living without this person. And the next hour or the next day, you can have moments of disbelief, of I cannot believe that they are not here for this moment or for this day. And I'll always have people say that, am I doing this wrong? Am I healing incorrectly? Am I crazy? And I want you to know that that's a very normal reaction to have with grief. And if you have people on your team who are grieving, I want you to be very mindful that they may have periods of times where they are super functional and they're doing okay, and another moment of tearfulness or feeling very stuck. And that is a very normal thing to be experiencing. Now, as we look closer at common grief reactions, I want you to know that each person's grief and how they grieve will be as unique as their fingerprint. There's really no right or wrong way to be grieving. You may find that some people want to speak about it, and you may find other people who completely shut down and they don't feel comfortable speaking about it. Some people may find comfort in looking at pictures, and some people may not. There's really no right or wrong way. And I'll often find that some people will become extremely functional. They'll focus on the paperwork and the tasks and what needs to happen and what needs to be done. Those individuals will usually be painted as the strong ones, but really the strong ones are just functional. And functionality does not mean I'm okay, because someone can be functioning really high, but also really be struggling with how they're feeling. Those individuals will typically have more of a delayed reaction to their grief. Okay? So emotionally, and remember, grief is not just a sad time, and it's not only the emotion of sadness. So you can imagine that grief is really any emotion you can imagine. There can be a sense of shock, denial, numbness, or disbelief, confusion, agitation, anger, feeling very irritable, overwhelmed. You can imagine that experiencing a loss is like when the wound is fresh, it's like a fracturing of yourself. I've had someone say to me that especially in those early weeks of their loss, that it felt like their center of gravity had been destroyed, not knowing what is up, down, left, right. And you can imagine that it can almost feel like life is a bit of a dreamlike state. Now, some of the intensity of those emotions will soften over time, but as you're moving forward, any of these emotions can be wrapped in those waves that come very unpredictably. Okay, so there can be a feeling of disappointment, sadness, tearfulness. If there was a loved one who was ill for quite some time, there may be a sense of relief. There may be guilt for feeling that. If you know someone who's been sick for quite some time, you can experience anticipatory grief. That even before the loss occurs, you can see waves of these unpredictable emotions. There may be anxiety and fear. When most of us move through our life with a bit of an invincible bubble around us, we feel quite safe. Even when we're reading the news and different things are happening. And when grief occurs, when that happens in your life, it's almost like there's a shattering of this bubble around you, and you can feel quite anxious and less safe in your life. You can see wrapped in the grief can be worry. What if I lose someone else? What if something happens to me? And that's a very common grief reaction to have. Okay. How they can present in our behavior. And I'll say that it's one of the most common things I hear after grief occurs is, I can't relate to people in the same way that I used to. That people around me are speaking about work or projects or even things that related to COVID. And you're thinking, I'm finding it really hard to relate to this because my entire world has been disrupted. Yeah. So I need you to know that that's very normal, and that, when we speak about those, there's the person that you've lost, right? But then there's the secondary losses that occur. And for many people, they can be grieving who they were before the loss took place. Now, behaviorally, you may see trouble falling asleep, waking up too early, really disrupted sleep. And that will be very pervasive when grief is fresh. You should see a softening of that as time moves forward. You may see changes in weight, feeling really exhausted. Grief does impact us neurologically. So it is physical, emotional, spiritual. There can be a fogginess. You can also see a clumsiness, right? Like being quite disoriented, things feeling quite dreamlike. You may notice that there's a withdrawing from others, feeling less interested in the world. There may be nightmares. Some people may want to avoid reminders of the loss, and other people may find comfort in clothes and scents and being near memories. So grief is very physical. So it's interesting. The body keeps score. Right? So it is on a neurological cellular level, your body is changing. So physical symptoms, so remember those waves that come. It's not always cognitive waves or emotions. It can be a wave of feeling exhausted, tired, a heaviness or emptiness in your kind of stomach and in your heart. You may notice an oversensitivity to noise and kind of sensory things around you. You may notice muscle weakness, a lack of energy, or dry mouth. And these are just some of the common ones. Of course, this is not kind of covers everything, because for each person, it may manifest in your body a little bit differently. So there will be spiritual impacts to grief as well. So there can be a feeling of purposelessness, of beginning to question everything. Right? So imagine there's a seismic event that takes place. It's almost like a loss of the individual, but a shattering of the sense of self, where now you're saying, what is the point of things? What happens when we're not here anymore? Where is this person? Can I still communicate with them? What does this mean? All of these questions kind of bubble forth, right? Really quickly, and during a time when you're already feeling injured. I don't have the answers to these questions, and I don't know that one person does, but I need you to know that to ask these questions and to sit with them, or to ask why, is a part of the grieving journey. And some people may find great comfort in faith or spirituality, and other people may feel betrayed or angry and turn away. And there's really no wrong or right, but it's important that you allow yourself to be on this journey with a lot of compassion. And I will say that one of the reasons why at the Lighthouse especially, we are so passionate about our grief center is what we find in the region is that there can be so much shame around experiencing grief and thinking, why do I still feel this way? Why do I still feel so upset and hurt and devastated years on? Am I questioning my faith? Are my beliefs not strong? And it creates a lot of shame. But what we know is that it's actually healthy to allow yourself to express that, and very normal to be feeling that as time moves forward. So I'd like to speak to you now about some very pervasive, harmful myths related to grief. And I'll just say that as we're going through this and you're learning this, please be compassionate to yourself, because it's only when we know better that we can do better towards ourselves, towards the people we love in our lives, and also in your organizations. So it's a myth that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. That is simply not true. Imagine if you had a sprained ankle and you said, well, if I just keep walking on it and ignoring it, it will go away. You're actually risking it worsening. And so imagine when you think about grief or really difficult emotions, imagine them like in a teapot where the steam and pressure is rising, rising, rising. You must have a mechanism to release that pressure. Right? When we do not find ways of releasing, and that release can be talking about it, journaling, running, walking, expression of some sort. When we ignore it, it will manifest as a higher risk for developing depression, anxiety, addiction, or physical health issues. Okay? So another myth is that it's important to be strong in the face of loss. You do not have to do or be anything extra to be strong. Simply surviving through it and allowing yourself to feel the emotions we typically paint as weak, like crying or anxiety or fear, that does not mean that you're not being strong, right? To express emotion actually takes a lot of courage. And I think that when we live in quite an emotion-phobic culture. So you can imagine that for many people, even before the loss took place, there's an averse reaction to emotions. And then here comes this massive, catastrophic life event of losing someone in your life. And it's a surge of emotions. So it can put a huge strain on a system if you haven't been more attuned to your emotions, as many of us have not. Because most of us have not grown up in homes where there was more emotional attunement or really permission to feel your emotions. Another myth is that if you are not crying, then you are not grieving. That is not true. You can be very functional and very wounded, but not be crying. And I'll often have people say to me, well, why can't I cry? Does it mean that I'm not okay? Or does it mean that I didn't love this person? And that's just not true. Okay. And I find that men will get this a lot, and some women, which they'll say is, I'm not crying. Does that mean I'm okay? That's just not true. Okay. Grief should only last a certain amount of time and then you get over it. That's not true. Okay. You learn how to live with that loss, but it is never finished and completed and now I'm okay. There can be this real fantasy of resolution that it will go away and it will be done. Okay, but we know that you can be grieving 10 years on, 15 years on. You never forget. Another myth is that as you move forward with your life and you adjust to your loss, that it means you're forgetting. And that's simply not true. Okay, I know for many people there can be a lot of guilt, like I smiled or I had a day where I forgot what happened, right? Some other myths that once you are done grieving, that your life will return to normal. And really after grief has taken place, it's more about adjusting to the new normal of what it's like to live without this person and also what you're like after experiencing a loss. Another myth is that time heals all wounds. That's not true. It really depends on what you do with that wound. Imagine if a physical health physician said to you, you have an infection on your arm and, eventually time will just heal it. It's not true for mental health as well. It really depends on how you respond to that injury, how you're taking care of yourself. Are you being compassionate? Are you shaming yourself? So time does not heal all wounds. It depends on what you do with it, okay? If you are still talking about your loved one or feeling sad after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, it means you're stuck. That is a myth. That is not true, because as I've been saying today, it will come in these waves, and we know that that's very normal. And I'll say that no matter how many times I say this, even to people I've been working with for years, in relation to their grief, they'll, come back around a death anniversary, or perhaps there's a joyous occasion in their life or a devastating one. And they're feeling that huge tidal wave of grief. And they'll say to me, I thought I went through this. I thought I was doing this in a healthy way. And I'll always say, and in a patient way, is that is the nature of grief. It's not you. Yeah. And it's so important in your organizations to also understand that if someone wants to speak about someone, or if a wave arrives of sadness or wanting to speak about that loved one, it doesn't mean that they're stuck or something's wrong with them. That is actually a healthy expression of grief. But we live in a world where there's an enormous amount of death anxiety. So people do not feel comfortable speaking about loss. Almost getting close to it can make you feel uncomfortable. And so we tend to shy away, avoid, or distance ourselves from people who are grieving. Okay. Another myth is that you can only grieve a death. That's not true. So just as I was saying in the beginning, grief can be linked to the loss of a dream, right? So you can imagine there can be grief around, for example, when you think about infidelity, right? So there's also an enormous grief process. I cannot believe this has happened to me. Never in my dream or picture of a relationship or marriage did I imagine that this would happen. The same is true when there's sickness or something traumatic or difficult happens in your life. Getting fired. All of these things, there can be a massive amount of grief and loss linked to different situations. Yeah. And so even that secondary grief, it will present in this way where there is these waves and it kind of ebbs and flows throughout your life. Okay. And another huge myth is that men don't want to talk about their grief. That's just not true. Men grieve and feel as equally as women do, but there's a tremendous amount of stigma around men expressing emotions. And there's a really great book I've been reading. It's called Permission to Feel, and I highly recommend it. So when we're thinking about grief, I want you to know that there are no set stages, okay? So there's really going to be what we call these 4 tasks, but these tasks, you never complete them. You're typically going to ebb and flow through them. And the first task, to adjust to the reality of loss, okay? And now remember, you can have moments and days where there's been adjustment, and you can have other months or weeks where you feel a sense of disbelief or shock. That's very normal, so be very up and down. The second task, I would argue, is one of the most important tasks, which is, in order to carry your grief in a healthy way, you must give yourself permission to feel all of those emotions, right? So that means, people will say to me, well, should I keep is it okay if I distract myself, right? Like, I'm working and I'm doing this. There's really no one size fits all. Some people may find comfort in work, and some may be too exasperated, but it is important that you must have a conscious mechanism in your life to allow yourself to sit with the emotions that are there. The third task is to adjust to the reality of this new normal. What does it mean to not message this person, speak to them, call them, see them? And again, that also takes that's not something that finishes, right? The intensity can soften over time, but it will come in those unexpected waves. Another very normal longing in grief is to feel connected to your loved one. So that may be wanting to do something in honor of them, to wear something of theirs, to cook something the way that they did. There's a longing to feel closer. I had someone say to me once, her mother had died, and she said, I sleep with her scarf every night. And, my husband is like, what are you doing? I don't think that's healthy. And I'll say that it's very normal to long to feel closer, right? It's so important that as you understand how to grieve in a healthy way, this is not about resolution or fixing, right? It's about making sure that you're carrying it in a healthy way, okay? It can be really helpful for many people to have different rituals.
Some of the things that we need to be mindful of while grieving is: One, start to have a routine in your life. Make sure that you have some set meal times, set sleeping times, waking up times. This helps. The other is look after yourself. Watch what you eat, your alcohol consumption, your smoking consumption, exercising. These are some of the things that you want to keep in mind. Make a journal or write down all those things that you are really worried about. And then make a to-do list, which could include the financial aspect that maybe you need to take care of, or the sorting of the belongings, whatever it is. And be generous with the time that you give yourself. The other thing that you should keep in mind is do not make any big life-changing decisions for the first 6 months after the loss of a loved one. It is better to wait for 1 year, but 6 months definitely before you make any big decisions. Slowly try and increase the pleasant events, the events that gave you joy, whether it be family celebrations or office virtual casual meetings. Start to participate in that. Start to slowly expose yourself to those things that you dread. Maybe visiting a particular place or doing something that you jointly did that with that person. Be mindful of your thoughts. Thoughts that trigger your anger or guilt, like, why did this happen to me? Or thoughts like, oh, I should have done that, I should have done this. Okay, in hindsight, we all become geniuses. Okay, so don't be very harsh on yourself. Be kind to yourself. And ask yourself, if the person was here, what would they say at this time? And spot these unhelpful thoughts and stop them. And lastly, whenever you think of the person, think more from a point of view to celebrate their life. Sing the songs that they liked, cook the food that they enjoyed, and all the time think about the past, the love that you shared more positively.
We live in the hope that we can help others, we can reach out to others. इसीलिए बहुत खुशी की बात है कि अगर एक तरफ इतना दुख है, तो दूसरी तरफ बहुत सारे लोग हैं जो सबकी मदद कर रहे हैं। My late father हमें सूरजमुखी की कहानी बोला करते थे, that the sunflower always faces the sun. But what happens जब अंधेरा होता है और जब बहुत बारिश होती है, जब सूरज नहीं दिखता, तब सूरजमुखी और the sunflower किसे फेस करता है? Well, the truth is the sunflowers face each other. What a beautiful analogy. हमेशा पॉजिटिविटी और ऑप्टिमिज्म को फॉलो करना शायद मुश्किल होगा, लेकिन सेवा, काइंडनेस एंड ऑफरिंग योर स्ट्रेंथ टू अदर्स, योर हेल्प टू अदर्स, ये बिल्कुल पॉसिबल है. इन फैक्ट इट हील्स यू, इट हेल्प्स यू स्टे अफ्लोट. तो अगर आप जानते हैं that someone is struggling with COVID, तो उनके घर के बाहर आप दवाइयाँ पहुँचा सकते हैं, आप खाना डिलीवर करवा सकते हैं, आप उन्हें कॉल कर सकते हैं, not to ask कि कोविड कैसे हुआ, but to tell them we love you and we are here to support you in any way you'd like. तो आज हम श्रद्धांजलि देना चाहेंगे उन सबको जिन्हें हमने खो दिया है. हम चाहेंगे कि आप लोगों के दुख में हम शरीक हों, आप लोगों को दिलासा दें.